So my first question is the kind of opening of your book. You say that the Christian tradition is a problem. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean that Christian tradition is underneath most of the things theologians do, most of the conflicts between Christian communions, um, a lot of the tensions that seem doctrinal or practical or moral also have tradition as one of the stakes. Um, Sort of in Christian living, particularly among liturgical communions.
Mm.
And so,
You mean the question of how to be faithful to tradition, that there's disagreement on that?
yes, how to be faithful to tradition, whether one is being faithful to tradition, um, how to interpret the Christian present according to the Christian past, what even the content of Christianity is. It's frequently refracted through tradition and questions about tradition. To what degree a Christian community can respond to the present and in what ways it's permitted to respond to the present. That's also refracted through questions of tradition. So it's a mode of contesting faithfulness and a mode of contesting practical action as much as it's bickering about which rite in the church is the best and sort of which Eucharistic prayers are valid, things like that.
But more than just like worship, it's also about how to act, how to live, right? Whether the way one is living is faithful to the tradition, and then there's different ways that one can construe what being faithful to the tradition means, to the letter, to the spirit. Does things change? They're all very big questions.
Yes, and tradition is sometimes explicit in those big questions, but is often buried under the more urgent version of the question. So yeah, I wanted to make that explicit once again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think it's really true that, most of the things we talk about in the context of theology or kind of Christianity, at some point, tradition is doing a lot of heavy lifting under the surface, but it's often under the surface. And so the question of what do we mean by that and how it can be used by certain people to sort of make an argument, but without really doing the work of saying, well, what, is that even what we mean theologically by tradition, right? That kind of deeper question often goes unexamined.
Yeah, and I think so. Even those Christian communities that want to just turn around and move somehow sideways through history back to the original gospel, that's still a question of history and of whether one can even do that. And it can be negative in the sense that it elides logic and is just a kind of reference to power without being a reference to power. But it can also be quite positive in the sense that each community is trying to say, look, we're coherent in a way that somehow resembles the coherence of the earliest Christian communities, the people around Jesus. And that's a way of saying, we know Jesus, and we know the Jesus that the people who knew him originally knew him. And that's a really important Christian self-understanding, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really profound way of saying, I think what often is really central to communities is how do we go about seeing ourselves as that kind of person? Yeah, absolutely. I liked the one of the lines in your first chapter. You say, like a cracked cup split by a tragic irony and guilt, we spill poison and grace into the world. And I felt like that really sets up partly the sort of vision of what you're trying to get after, which obviously has an underlying, I think partly that reveals that this isn't just neutral, that there's a certain ecclesiology, there's, you know, that these are sort of deeper arguments that we have to make. I was reminded talking to an Anabaptist colleague of mine that with a perfectionist ecclesiology, you wouldn't be able to say that, right? That the church is something that that the sort of good and bad has come out of the history of that. But I see that as a big part of what you're trying to say is if we're going to account for this, we have to account for sort of all of it.
Yeah, yes, I try to take a position like that while also not violating certain Catholic positions about the church's infallibility and what's called indefectibility, which is the promise that the Spirit is always with the church. That's sort of the Spirit is indefectible, and it's sort of the church's relation to it isn't going to be suddenly lost. And so I say very quickly, trying to sort of gesture to Catholic sensibilities, look, we can have these things, but also we have to make some sense of Christian sin. So there's like a double claim there. On the one hand, the church as an instrument of divine grace is still true and is still sort of inviolately true. But also, Christians do sin. And that is also a pattern that isn't, I wouldn't say inevitable. So it's not inevitable, but that is because patterned, statistically likely to be repeated. And so that becomes a kind of like anti-sacrament, if you will. Like it's got the regularness of sacramental presence, but what it does is contradict the gospel, the life of grace, or the truth of God, things like that.
So one of the things that's interesting is you say that it's important that we sort of explain the place of sin in our history, but you also, I think, importantly say that on the other hand, sin is not explainable, right? Sin is something that's kind of by definition inexplicable. And I thought that, right, so you say that we cannot turn to sin in any fully systematic way, for sin is irrational and unintelligible, but we can deal with historical dynamics of sin. And I thought it was really helpful how well you distinguish throughout the book between those two kind of levels. Can you tell us a little bit about how
that was
you
really
do
hard.
that? Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. So yeah, the sin is a privation of the good. It's a very Augustinian idea. That
for an accessible audience, what does privation mean though?
Yeah. So yeah, sorry, I'm thinking, what would I say to students? So there are ways, so the world that God has made is good. And everything that exists is good, just purely by its existence. And so Augustine, instead of positing sin as a kind of something, as like an addition to the world, because that would imply that God's somehow responsible for sin because we're divine instruments. And so if we add something that you can understand to the world, that makes God will sin.
It means God the origin of sin, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of that, where you've got this chain there where God is ultimately responsible for a fallen world, Augustine says, well, what if sin is a kind of reduction of the good that is present, a kind of absence, but it's not a positive missing piece, sort of like if I had a pitcher that can sort of measure amount of water, you know, and I could measure, well, this amount is missing from the pitcher. That's not what Augustine is saying, but he is saying that sin is that good that God willed to be present through your acting that you didn't do, and that unintelligible absence, that's what sin is. And you get this medieval tradition that tries to formalize and systematize what that means, but that's sort of where Augustine begins. And God isn't responsible for our not acting, but it does throw a wrench in the universe that God then addresses through divine acting. Is that helpful? Should I say
That's
more?
very helpful. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah. So now we connect that understanding of sin back to the question of tradition. So what you're saying is that there's sin in our tradition, and it can be explained as an absence, but it can't be explained otherwise. Am I getting this right so far?
Yeah, so it can't be explained formally at all, because if you could explain it, that would make it understandable by minds, by intelligence. That would make it true in some way, and therefore good in some way. So that's not what it is. But it's true that the instrument of Christian tradition is us, ourselves, our lives in some way. And those lives include not just goodness, not just liturgy and sacrament, but also our sin. And so at first glance, if I look at Christian history, I see both things. And from the sort of helicopter view of all of history, or maybe like Saint Benedict near the end of Gregory the Great's life of Benedict is lifted up before the cosmos and sees all of history. If I do that, then I do see Christian sin. I know it's part of divine providence somehow. I also know that tradition is part of divine providence somehow. And the question of the book is, how do I account for those things? How do I seriously confront those kinds of facts? And maybe one example of what happens with sin in particular is that those facts become very important, because even though the rationalizations and the patterns are in a certain sense explainable, the action itself remains inexplicable. And so sort of never justified, in other words. That's what makes it wrong. If it were natural or inevitable, then it's not wrong. It's just, you know, some natural function or some directly willed divine intervention.
If you can explain sin, then you can explain it away. That's kind of
Yeah. Or like giving a reason for sin is essentially giving an excuse for it, which is making it no longer sin. Yeah,
yes.
That makes sense.
Or if I kind of like lower the plane at which sin happens, where it's a kind of sub-rational process that's a fundamental element of fallen human nature, well, that's also a thing I can't be held responsible for. I can't be guilty of. And so then, you know, it's also just, you know, animals are violent. It's not really their fault, kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is very relevant for our series because, as we said, we've had an episode talking all about the Crusades. We've had an episode talking all about the Inquisition. We've had 2 episodes talking about religious violence, and then an episode on colonialism. These are all instances in insofar as Christians have participated in those things, these are instances where we would say Christian tradition shows us doing stuff we really ought not to do. And the instinct, I think, for those of us who care about tradition, I think almost everybody does to a certain extent, is to try and explain those things away, to try and justify them, or to try and defend them, say, oh, it wasn't quite as bad as all that, or it was, everybody else was doing it at the time, or something like that, to try and get rid of it somehow.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, you've got a number of justifications that are, I mean, they're understandable, because you're trying to protect the idea that Christianity is coherent, that it's a real communal life.
Well, exactly. There feels this threatening idea that if we did actually seriously mess up in any of those instances, then maybe we're not reliable witnesses of the truth, and so maybe we can't actually trust Christianity at all. I think that's the lying at the very bottom of this, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I can say, well, actually, it was good. It's great. I can attribute a kind of ignorance to it, and like even medieval sort of theologies of sinning would say, well, it's still wrong, even if you're ignorant of its wrongness. Your guilt is modified, but it's not good. Yeah, De las Casas has this interesting moment.
That's Bartolome de las Casas, 16th century Dominican friar.
Yeah, he was fundamental in the development of the African slave trade, the triangle that sort of led to the Americas. He was fundamental in the adoption of that in Latin America, in Spain, so on. And it was to try to protect the indigenous people in the Americas who were dying from the kinds of slavery that they were being subjected to, the disease, etc. But he realizes near the end of his career what he's done, even though he's used typical medieval logic about warfare and slavery to do so. And he asks for forgiveness. And I find that moment quite profound. Not just
who does he ask for forgiveness?
Oh, he asks God for forgiveness.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I forget which part of his writings this is in. It's quoted sometimes. But yeah, he begs God for forgiveness because even if he meant well, as a good priest, he knows that's really not sufficient. And so, yeah, I think his humility there is instructive, because as much as we might want to make him a hero, he himself sees the enormous door, the Pandora's box, that he's helped to open. Certainly not alone, but rather than diffuse his own guilt, he begs forgiveness.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
it's a profound
go.
principle, because I mean, this is why prudence is the queen of the virtues, right? Is this, good intentions aren't good enough. And that's very often where we're at, is that we do things because we didn't realize. And I think it's important that we have an account of sin that says, I mean, these things are destructive, whether you knew or not, and to some degree we're culpable. I think particularly people who are able to repent of those things are often fewer and far between, maybe.
It's hard. I mean, it's a moment where I really have to trust that divine grace can operate on enormous nonsensical situations that I've helped put into being. And even if we're used to saying we trust God, it's a big deal to say, oh no, I can't fix this by merely doing more good. It's something much more than that. And yeah, it's quite difficult. And it certainly doesn't mean that I sit around and wait, which is also difficult. One of my favorite things about Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle is when she describes how the human being begins. So I'm supposed to explore the interior castle, which is my soul, the deepest part of me, to discover God there. And she says, well, we start off outside of ourselves. We have no idea who we are. We're just out hanging out with various lizards, problems, and we don't know ourselves at all. So the first step is to go inside at all. And I love the brazen honesty of that.
We start off outside of ourselves. I like that.
Yeah.
That's really good. Yeah, the this idea of authenticity, and if we're outside of ourselves, what are we being authentic to, is interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's really, so this, I think, is a really, really helpful way of, I think, first realizing when we're asking these big questions about, the darkness in our history, we need to kind of get down to like, well, what do we think sin is? Do we think Christians sin? What does that mean on a bigger scale? I think realizing that piece, sometimes people are so defensive about Christianity, and it's always been good, and it's like, well, but Christianity teaches that we're fallen, and they're like, oh well, yes, so it should be an obvious thing, really, that we're like, of course, right, the whole point is that we're fallen, otherwise, all of this, but there's something really difficult about sort of seeing that in history, and what do we do with that, and how do we see nonetheless God's grace within that, I think, is the really tricky thing. And it's really tempting to just move too quickly to like, well, I'm sure it's good. I'm sure it was all, pretty chill. And you, I think, really, one of the things that I really appreciated, and I think this is something that you share with Willie Jennings, or you kind of connect this, is the kind of razor edge distinctions that we would have to make to sort of see the good and the bad clearly. And that there's a lot of work that we need to do maybe to get that kind of vantage point.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, the distinctions are going to be intellectual, and those distinctions are invisible. That's how razor I mean. The distinctions are.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, which I think that is, it's quite significant, right? That it's something, that we need a kind of, and this is something I want to talk about as well, a kind of heuristic, a kind of explanatory framework to enable us to sort of see some distinctions here, but that is a different kind of task than recognizing just the kind of sweep of history and the details of kind of what has happened. Can you tell us a little bit about that distinction? So this idea of like a metaphysic of tradition, and how does that differ from just studying history?
What is a metaphysic of tradition? Yeah, that's a good thing to unpack there.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's the weird thing I do. And it's the kind of the made up phrase that I'm not sure is gonna live on past the book. But yeah. So in a Catholic context, since I do Catholic theology, Catholics are accustomed to discussing tradition primarily in terms of hermeneutics, interpretation, and also authority. And in from out of those concerns, then looking at history in order to understand the content of the Church of Christianity, that kind of thing. Excuse me. And that's very much a kind of ingrained response, because for example, probably the most relevant example, at least for Catholics, it's going to be things like the Council of Trent, and what's at stake there in late medieval Catholicism is the content of Christianity. And so tradition gets filtered through this very concrete historical experience of the Reformation, And
With the
it's
Council of Trent, just for the to make it accessible to the average reader, was a Catholic council that was largely responding to the Protestant Reformation. So it was defining Catholicism in some ways over against some of the new Protestantism that hadn't existed before.
And reforming it too, reforming Catholicism. So it even introduces a kind of logic for renewal that the Council of Trent becomes, because they don't have councils really after that for a long time, but still Trent is invoked to introduce further reforms over time. So yeah, it's a big deal. And that question of content remains really fundamental. And that continues in the 19th century when everyone, I could probably push it further back historically, but let's say for simplicity, the 19th century, Catholic Church runs headlong into the idea, as John Henry Newman puts it, that the church is subject to history. And so that implies change. And that is another huge crisis that's again about content. How does the church today correctly proclaim the gospel of yesterday, today, and tomorrow?
And the unchanging God, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so we have several huge fights about that. And therefore the little white blood cells of theologians moving to the wound are trying to think about how to make sense of tradition, scripture, and the trustworthiness of the content, authority, the practices, functions of the Catholic Church. So that happens over a couple hundred years. What I wanted to do in the book, so the reason I didn't do this weird phrase thing, is to help to reintegrate the present status of the question by moving a little bit to the left of content, first of all. So the question of what's in it, what counts, what's outside of it, what doesn't count, and move a little bit to the side of that just to ask, okay, well, how does it exist though? Because metaphysics is a question of existence in its broadest possible categories, meaning just existing. What are the ways that existence persists through time? That's my question. And only in a secondary sense is it about interpretation and content. And similarly, I do my best to move away from the primary metaphor that 19th century Catholics, influenced by Romanticism, used to try and talk about tradition, or for various metaphors around life, living, growth. That's the way they start to tackle this question of, oh no, the church is subject to history. But that's very imprecise, because life is a lot of things, and being living means a lot of things. And so I did my best to never say the word life, to try and make my metaphysics more precise. Because but like some metaphysics you can say being endlessly and then sort of also never really say anything. And so I wanted to avoid doing that kind of very general and unhelpful metaphysics.
Gosh, there's a lot of stuff to avoid there.
Yeah. And it's also about using the people who integrated and thought about these things in the Catholic world to do so. So in a sense, like, I treat these past figures that I look at as useful in this modified task that I give them, that I ask with them, that they've got layers in their work that life, that hermeneutics has in a sense concealed. And how can I bring those things to light?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't necessarily picked up on that, but now that I think of it, it is, yeah, I think really sets apart what you're doing in interesting ways too, right? Because your book came out around the same time as David Bentley Hart's, and that was one of his big critiques, was those kind of metaphors of life and the kind of evolutionary framework. Maybe at some point we can talk about what you think of his book, but yeah, I think but this is
Well, I
so,
want to try and keep to the actual content at the
exactly.
moment.
So
Yeah.
this idea of, I think a lot of people when they think of tradition is content, right? So it's a set of things that we believe and certain traditions.
It's called tradition because it's something we've always believed and we've always held,
Mhm.
or we've always done sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a list of like, we believe these things, think about like a creedal statement, maybe a set of like liturgical practices. We do these things when we gather, and we hold to this tradition because that's just how it's been done, I think is often what people think of. And so I think that's really helpful how you kind of push beyond that and sort of don't want to talk too much about content, to say that tradition actually is this much bigger question. Because that, sorry to back up a second, this idea then that is subject to history. You know, for listeners who have been following this whole series, you know, this is what we've been talking about when we thought about the historical method, the rise of the historical method in relation to biblical scholarship, this idea that things like change and transform through different kind of historical periods. And that's a big question if you're like, well, our tradition is just what it's always been, and that's why we care about it. But if the tradition can change through the course of history, then what does that mean, right? So this becomes
Then is
a
it
kind of
trustworthy?
crisis.
Is it reliable?
Yeah, and how could it be trustworthy, and what would that look like? And then so we end up having to push deeper to say, well, what do we mean by tradition? And you kind of, by giving us a metaphysic of tradition, you're giving us a kind of theoretical concept to then sort of bring into engagement with the actual facts of the past, things that happened. And that's at least how I read it, right? And so, and particularly you kind of bring it into conversation with issues of kind of race and colonialism, right? So if we have this kind of theoretical idea, how does it help us make sense of, or does it help us make sense of the actual facts on the, you know, on the ground of our history? Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. It's kind of like my example as we go along of, okay, I'm trying to help us fight better. I want us to disagree well. So here's an example of me trying to theorize about tradition, but then apply the theory to some concrete problem in Christian history.
Well, I'd love to hear that concrete problem applied then.
Yeah, so can we talk through a couple of examples of this then?
Yeah.
And maybe to sort of set up that, well, let's just jump into the first one. So we have, you sort of begin a chapter with Bernard Lonergan, who kind of, and he helps you set up not just tradition, but like history itself. What is history? And that is also a big, I think, a deep question. And then he kind of is in conversation with Sean Copeland. Can you tell us a little bit about what that conversation looks like?
Yeah. So, I had thoughts and I lost it. Yeah. So Bernard Lonergan. So maybe to give a sense of the structure of the book in its shape. Basically, each chapter asks some big question that involves tradition. First chapter, what is history? Since tradition is historical. Second chapter, what is tradition? Since that's not quite the same as history. But then, what does it mean to call tradition temporal, that it takes place in time, since the first chapter establishes that history and time are not the same thing. Then, finally, to make it a theology, really, how is it that God acts in time, in tradition, in history, such that Christian tradition is? So those are the four main chapters. And then chapter 5 is kind of like the reward after doing metaphysics with me for 4 chapters. Yeah. So Lonergan is the start, and he kind of lets me explain why that framework is useful, what a heuristic is, those kinds of things. What do I mean by metaphysics? What do I mean by reality? So Bernard Lonergan is this Canadian Jesuit from the 20th century, and he does a lot of different things. What I found helpful about him is that he asks very basic questions about the kinds of things we're always talking about. So he asks, what is history? Because we usually call things historical without saying, well, okay, but what is that? And then each chapter, I turn to some person of color to have them help me take that theorizing and then rethink it with their help in the light of this problem of colonialism, racism, and sin. Yeah, so Lonergan says history is human action. It's his maximal definition of what it is, which lets me name what it is without knowing all of history or all the details of history. But his last student was Sean Copeland, who's a Catholic womanist theologian, so a Black Catholic woman, who takes his thinking in a new, and I would say broader frame of reference. And so she thinks hard about racism, being Black, being oppressed. And so she helps give the first major gestures to the problems in the book by talking about the ways that the turn to the subject in history is actually a turn to power, power negatively understood, power over others. And she responds theologically by putting the oppressed at the center of history as a sort of fundamental lever for the theologian to look at, to help the theologian make sense of what God is doing in history. They have to look to the least of these.
So the oppressed are the driving force behind history from a Christian point of view.
Right.
That's what Sean Copeland said. It's really interesting. I can sort of see that from the Bible, actually.
Yeah. It's got roots in liberation theology, but much older roots too, even in like Christian legends. So my favorite version of this is Saint Lawrence, who was this deacon in Rome. So he was in charge of the stuff of the local community. It's one of the things deacons seem to have done. At least the legend sort of gives us a hint at. And he's asked to hand over the riches of the church by some Roman officials.
So it's a sort of persecution thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a kind of early persecution story that gets trying to make sense of a kind of Christian experience. And what's interesting about the story is, I mean, usually martyrdom stories, and St. Lawrence's does involve like blood and gore and courage in the face of death and sort of bravely facing one's death because on the other side is resurrection, that kind of thing. But what I like about this story is he's got to hand over the riches of the church. So I'm in my head, because I don't entirely historically know how to envision it, I'm like, gold chalices, that's what they want. They're going to melt them down somehow, I don't know. And so Lawrence says, all right, the riches of the church, and then he gathers the poor of Rome and brings them to the officials. And of
All
course,
the
they
poor
are
people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so even in that relatively early, or like of the early, mid-early Christian stories, you've got that idea that who God is interested in is actually those that are least important, those that don't matter, the ones who are not talented, that you wouldn't have on your team, the person who's last for the kickball game. That's God's favorite. God wants them. And so it's quite an old idea that I think Copeland does a really nice job of expanding, systematizing, gearing toward modern problems. So she helps me do that because I'm not as good at it as she is.
What sort of stuff does she say then?
Yeah, so one of the big articles for me is Turning Theology, and then one of the big books for me from her is In Fleshing Freedom. And at least from what I remember, since I'm not going to pretend I remember all of my book. Some of the moves that she makes that are the most helpful to me are not only this idea that you have to turn to the oppressed, which is a heuristic category because who's oppressed changes. So she's expanding my heuristic, which is really a big deal. She also gives principles like even when we remember Christian history, we ought to remember the oppressed in history, Christian history. So that's going to inform not just the way the theologian interprets history, but sort of points of interest that they're going to borrow to help them problem solve in the present tense. Like I have a friend, Jess Koblentz, who does this she writes a Theology of Depression, which is a very modern problem, but she still looks to the Christian past for help in solving it. So it's things like that. And she also gives this, I mean, it's very traditional, but a kind of astonishing use of tradition, at least for me. In Fleshing Freedom, Sean Copeland puts the mystical body of Christ as a sort of fundamental, active principle in church life. And what she means there is there's actually, from not just an eschatological point of view, but from the point of view of how Christian history operates, how it lives, dragging us, if you will, forward in history, is the total Christ, the mystical body of Christ, the end of time. And that gives her a way of talking about a reality, a divine reality, a divine sort of human community that transcends the problems that we're talking about, so that you've got what Blundell calls the radical leveling, the radical equalizing of all in Christ as the animating divine gesture that not just gives the theologian something to look at, but inflames the theologian's heart to treat problems, inflames the heart of the Christian community, because we're driving toward that end, and that end is helping us get there. And it's such an old Catholic idea. It's even medievally sounding, but she's using it in this new context to embrace the problem in something much larger than the problem itself. And I haven't read every book, but a lot of books end with the problem. and then say, I don't know, or end with the problem and say, I hate this. And she's got, because it's hard.
Yeah.
And she's like, yes, of course, those reactions, but also God is at work. And that should make us even sort of more passionate, more courageous in the ways that we confront Christian problems.
Yeah, it's really, I think, one of the things I think you say when talking about her is, if history is about human action, all of us, we must take a corrective step to ensure that all really is all right? And so there's a kind of theology here that's shifting our focus and saying, what do we mean, right? What do we mean by history? And even that, I think, and that's, again, points to this idea of a heuristic or a kind of explanatory set of categories is helpful, because we only look where we have reason to look. And so this kind of reorients us in how we look. And even, I mean, I don't know how much this isn't exactly the content of what you take from her, but, this idea, if we have a different idea of history and of tradition, we're going to look different places, we're going to tell different stories, because there's a big temptation to tell the history of Christianity as a history of winners who conquered and were the best and the strongest and the richest, and, and be like, Christianity, we're the best. And I think just realizing that we don't have good theological reasons to celebrate that, a lot of the things that we celebrate in our history as the space where we're looking for God's action, actually God's action is typically over here. And when we overlook that, we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes we're like, oh, right, I don't know, do we see God's hand at work? And it's like, well, I don't know, were you just looking in the treasury, or were you looking at the, at the margins where God is most powerfully at work typically? But this is the kind of stuff that I think really came to mind a lot, was just, what do we mean when we tell the history of our traditions? What kind of categories are we using? Are we valuing that kind of thing? I think I found this, really, really insightful on those levels.
Yeah. You can cut this out if you want, but can I give a very boring definition of explanation according to Bernard Lonergan?
Yeah, of course.
So I find this useful. Bernard Lonergan contrasts description and explanation. Description gives features of a problem. It gives some terms maybe of a problem. It starts to say what it's like. It might start from experience or something like that. But explanation gets a handle on all of the relevant terms, all of the relevant operations, and how they relate to each other. So it's a way of stepping into the realm of theory to say, well, what's the total picture, not in every detail, but in terms of what makes it function, and that's explanation.
Yeah, interesting. I love Lonergan. He's always helping with very precise problems that I didn't know I had until I read him.
I know, he's so helpful. I told this to Father Doran, who helped edit all of the books of Lonergan's collected works, so I feel okay saying this. But Lonergan is kind of my theological duct tape. If I've got this problem and it's very boring but very important, I bet Bernard Lonergan thought about it and wrote about it, and I just need to find where, and I'm going to use it.
I'm not sure that's a compliment.
So helpful.
That is great. It's true though. He's like, actually, I've thought a lot about this, and you're like, I only just thought about it, but this is, and it's random, but it explains a lot of stuff.
This is great. Yeah.
Can I ask?
What is an insight? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Can I ask a somewhat challenging question about taking these ideas about how we see the tradition as both grace and sin, and how we have to learn to see our own past differently and our own history differently. How do you see that affecting how the church engages in evangelism?
Yeah, that's good. So I would say, just as speaking of Lonergan, to be annoying and technical, Christian tradition is not Christian sin. That is a big part of the book. Catholics are used to saying this. Hopefully I say it better and more precisely. Christian history is Christian virtue and Christian sin. But
Right.
Christian tradition is not, unless it's not intelligible, right?
Yeah.
But as a intelligible function of the community, Christian tradition technically is not the sin. But remember, it's going to be an intellectual distinction. So it's not going to look that way. Even when I look at a single saint's life, I'm going to have to intellectually distinguish between what's good in them and what needs redemption. Is that helpful?
Yeah, a little, yeah. So if Christian tradition is not the sin, I'm not quite sure where to take that, but like,
Yeah, so it's and that is this a distinction between the history of Christian action involves sin. But tradition is capturing something more specific than that. The kind of continuity of
tradition names something specific about what the community does.
what I'm interested in probing is this question of how Christians are meant to present themselves to the wider world, to the community around them who are not Christian and don't belong to the church. How are we supposed to present Christianity when we talk about it?
Yeah.
Like, are we supposed, like, obviously there's bad extremes that I want to avoid here. We don't want to just airbrush all of the difficult moments in Christian history out. But I also feel like it's disingenuous to front load them and say, oh yeah, well, we've made lots of mistakes in the past, but thank goodness we're a lot better now.
Yeah, I don't say that, no.
Yeah.
I mean, despite ourselves, most of the time, we maintain these intelligible activities of many kinds through time. Yeah. So I think maybe let me get to I'll get to one typical way Catholics solve this problem that's kind of helpful, kind of not. I sort of like underwrite it, but then try to nuance it. And then I'll get back to your practical problem. So Catholics are often used to talking about big T tradition and then traditions. Yves Congar wrote a book with basically that title. And it's a first step at trying to say, well, Christians do a lot of things, and many of them, in a sense, are quite traditional. So Christian anti-Jewishness, technically, it's quite traditional. It's a very old practice. But we don't want to say that that's like the formal tradition that hands on the gospel, because that's horrifying.
You'd hope not, yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to say that. And so a first gesture is to say, well, some things are constitutive or fundamental, or the tradition we mean when we are formally defining it. And other things are traditional in a much more lax, colloquial, local sense that can change a great deal depending on time and place, right? And you can see that it's a kind of first attempt to really start to like think about this, but it doesn't like, speaking as a Catholic who can do this a lot, it is kind of an escape hatch where I can say, well, but the awesome things, yeah, those are really tradition. And that might skip over the way that in concrete history, those things exist together. They're not separate. I don't suddenly walk through a door into the true tradition and away from Christian anti-Jewishness. They're going to be literally in the same cathedral. In the
And in the same saint, as you said, yeah.
Yeah, same saint. Yeah. So it's much harder than that. And so the question is, like, how's this going to change things like evangelization? And it's actually been interesting. It's actually been interesting to watch the Vatican try to figure this out, particularly because the Vatican has to make big gestures, since it's the centralizing engine for Catholic things. And they've had a synod in the Amazon. They've relatively recently, Pope Francis met in Canada with Indigenous peoples. And so you've got these gestures, and they're extremely imperfect, but these gestures that are starting to think through, for example, do I have to have a European culture to be a Catholic? And the heuristic answer, particularly since, I'll say, the middle of the 20th century, has been no. What that means concretely has been much more difficult to figure out. And
trying to separate European culture from the essentials of Christianity. It sounds nice when you just say, oh, we can just separate it. But then when you actually try and do it, you're like, actually, where does one begin and the other end? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So do I need to know ancient Greek to affirm
or Latin? Yeah.
Latin to affirm essential doctrines about salvation, the Trinity? I mean, to be a theologian, it's certainly going to help me. But to be a Christian, a daily Christian, I should hope not. Even if theology and teachers haven't totally figured that out, which is one of the challenges, is there's always going to be, even if you've got a broad heuristic intellectual solution, there's going to be a practical lag, a historical lag in figuring out it's living out, like it's living, what it means to live it. And because living is concrete, it's not theoretical. And so you've got like the Indigenous peoples of Canada directly asked the Pope, hey, can you deny the doctrine of discovery? Can you say that's not okay? Which is a big deal in modern European colonialism.
What's the doctrine of discovery?
I'm going to oversimplify it, if that's all right, but it's sort of like, if I'm the first to discover it, plant a flag on it, and there aren't any Christians there, it's mine. To make a Christian. So Spanish colonialism and Portuguese colonialism follow this model.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It gets modified over time, and that's one of the earlier versions. And particularly in the case of Spain and Portugal, the Vatican is directly involved in the development. And so you've got this, they borrow language from modern ecumenism to try and say the doctrine of discovery is wrong. And they do say that. That's not Christian doctrine. Don't support it. But they also get very invested in whether the church ever formally taught it, which is a kind of that's a memory of the Reformation showing up again, right? All right, but also this other problem. And so it's a very imperfect document, I would say, but it's so fascinating because they're trying to respond to the main thing you have to do if you're going to figure out how to evangelize people where they are without just kind of making them all like you, is to talk to them and then the problem solve about it. And so that's what's imperfectly happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is it's really fascinating. I think, and seeing, I mean, it's really helpful to have a concrete example like that, because I think it really brings to bear these big questions, right? Of, you know, a lot of people think the fact that Christianity is kind of enmeshed in a history of injustice, some people just want to deny that, right? There are plenty of people that are just like, yeah, that's actually not true. Christians have always been good, but most people kind of recognize, like, yeah,
that's the bad Christians, and they're not really
and
Christians.
yeah, that's right. That's the other ones, and we're the good Christians. But if you do kind of, if you're willing to recognize that, often people feel stuck between, well, either we hold to the tradition and then we just continue to perpetuate that injustice, or we just need to reject tradition and overthrow the injustice. And I think this idea of, you know, is there a third way between that, and what does that look like? And is it possible to say, I think, again, we've come back to this a couple of times. I was surprised actually when we talked to Willie James Jennings, how much he said you have to be able to distinguish who's what is true to Christianity and what isn't. And I think you really help, really push into like what's the heuristic task, like what do we mean by kind of true and Christian, and then we look at the past, but also that doing that in the present isn't easy, right? Because if we make those judgments, it raises questions about who we've been and what's brought us here, and again, what we hold sacred, how we understand our tradition, and every different tradition is having to wrestle with those things, and I think these kinds of questions, often we're not engaging them, and so it's just, well, what's easiest? It's easiest for us to especially in contexts where our tradition isn't that important to us. It's easy to just kind of say, let's just toss it, and we'll do better in the future.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
Which you're kind of like, oh, are you going to do better in the future? This sounds questionable to me.
I'm just going to start with the totally unproblematic New Testament and Old Testament, or like commit a kind of Marcion or a Thomas Jefferson and figure out which parts of the Bible are good and which aren't. And that is a kind of solution, but I don't really think it works. To be honest. Yeah, so one of my practical interests was, is it possible to start over? And this might be a kind of Catholic pessimism, but I don't think so.
Break away completely and just start completely afresh, as if nothing had happened before. Well, yes. I mean, I know a lot of Christian communities that think they're doing that.
Yes, right. Which is great. I'm not really acting from that point of view. There is a kind of beginning again that I do accept, but at least from the point of view of the book, this like complete reset isn't a possibility. The absolute revolutionary imagination, because you have this very practical problem. Like, I am the problem in a lot of ways. I'm a white scholar. I mainly do liberal arts kind of things, great book stuff, but you can like burn my house down and you're still stuck with me, and I still have all the habits that are the problem. And you can try to get rid of those people, but there are a lot of people. And something that Copeland and Jennings and Baldwin say very profoundly is that the oppressors are changed by oppression, but so are the oppressed. No one escapes unscathed. And so there's not a reset button for that. And what's interesting about Christianity is that Jesus, the incarnate word, is not a divine reset button. God acts. That's a very interesting point. God acts in the history that has already happened and introduces a new principle of action that supernaturally transforms the situation as it already is. Jesus is a human like us. He's got a mom like we've got. He enters into the history that has already occurred. He himself is this new principle of action, and that's how God does it. And certainly I'm not more powerful than God. And so instead what the book imagines is that you've got this community, the Christian community, that has new principles of action. And by principle of action, I mean, of course, the logos, right? Ideas, new virtues like charity, forgiveness, but also like those require God's assistance to do. And only God can legislate them. Only God can make that a law for a community. And so you've got this community in the midst of the world that already is, that's acting according to this sort of new transformative supernatural action. And so from within history, it transforms history. That's the kind of revolution that the book imagines, which is why it's sort of easier for the book to confront double situations, where you've got a situation that's like not transformed, or has a community that's trying to transform it, but we're like, is it better? That kind of thing, because it imagines that the action is in the middle of historical forces as they already exist.
We
Yeah, and so
wrap this up.
So it gives I think a kind of profound way of glimpsing and questioning again, what does it mean to look for God's action in history among us, and sort of recenter ourselves on our reliance on him, and again, starting afresh, on our own abilities and doing it perfect this time. We lose out on all that we learn from that history as well, but also we forget that we're inevitably formed by it, right? And there's no immediate escape from it, but God makes it possible for the future to be different from the past in some way, but that's a historical process.
Right, yeah. So it's going to require the hardest part, which is constant recalibration. And Lonergan's pretty good at that. Like, all right, you've acted in a new way. Well, now you have a new situation, and you have to kind of start over and ask, what do I do now? And it's going to require a constant refiguration of how I am and who I am. And I'm always going to be catching up to new situations. But that's much better than keeping things as they are. And there's a kind of trust that God is operant in all of those actions, even though I'm just in control of me.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us about these questions. There's much more to be learned from your book, so we encourage anyone to pick it up. Nothing Gained is Eternal is the title of the book. But yeah, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.